Hey again everyone, Lex here, and today I wanted to go over an issue I've noticed more and more as I've been playing Path of Exile 2, both in this league and since 0.1. And that issue is wording consistency and accuracy on things like skill gem tooltips, item descriptions, passive node descriptions, etc. I'll be honest, I think GGG does a pretty good job overall because this is a game with just so many different mechanics and tags and categories, synergies, anti-synergies, all that stuff. It's a lot to keep track of. However, throughout the course of playing Path of Exile 2's early access and with the full 1.0 release around the corner, I'm noticing that there are some issues with wordings and descriptions of how certain mechanics are supposed to work in the game, which I do think should be looked at before 1.0 hits, because I think they could potentially misguide newer players and even confuse some veteran ones, assuming that, you know, an item or mechanic should work a certain way based on how things are worded, and then they just don't. And again, as I always say at the beginning of these critical videos, I still really love the game. I mean, the league's basically over and I'm still playing it a ton because I have so much that I want to experiment with, and I genuinely just love the dopamine hits compared to any other action RPG on the market at this point. But that's not to say that this game is without its faults, so let's just get into a few of the examples of what I'm yapping about here. First up, a familiar face for many of you, Herald of Ash. So why did I say that? If you've been following my channel for a while, I think I've talked about this like 4 or 5 times across a bunch of my videos because this tooltip problem has been in the game since the beginning of early access. And that problem is this. Herald of Ash's tooltip says it ignites in 4 different places, and guess what? Nope, it doesn't ignite. Not even a little bit. I think this is because the skills effect was essentially imported from Path of Exile 1, which is fine, but GGG seemingly had plans to make this skills damage over time effect inflict the ignite status ailment, which it does not do in Path of Exile 1, and it does not do in Path of Exile 2 either. It just deals a burning fire damage over time effect, which is pretty useful these days, but again, it's not an ignite. So why is this a problem? It should be obvious, but there are a ton of support gems, nodes on the passive skill tree, etc. that all synergize or gain benefits from ignited enemies, as well as just potentially increasing ignite magnitude and expecting it to buff up the Herald of Ash damage, but none of this stuff synergizes or works with Herald of Ash because, again, it is incapable of igniting. GGG, please, I am once again asking you to change the wording on this tooltip to accurately describe this as burning damage over time, and to remove the ignite tag from it because it does not ignite, as I've been saying. I mean, even if you have plans to make this actually ignite, that's fine, but just temporarily change the wording until you do, because right now it doesn't, and that's all there really is to say about that. It would be cool to change this before release because it was confusing to me when I first played the game, even back in 0.1. Anyways, moving on to the next one. I think this is actually more representative of what I'm talking about here because it's a little less obvious than Herald of Ash saying it does something that it doesn't. But we're going to talk about the effect on the Sacred Flame Shrine Sceptre. It's really this last line of the tooltip that we are concerned with here, which is an effect that is unique to this item, and it reads, enemies in your presence resist elemental damage based on their lowest resistance. So how does this work? Basically, all elemental damage you deal to targets will make those targets resist your elemental damage using their lowest resistance, regardless of the type of elemental damage you are dealing, excluding chaos. I think players have tested this, but this means that, say you are dealing fire damage and come across a mob with a silver tier frost resistance and gold tier fire resist, meaning that would normally reduce your fire damage by like 75% or more. It will instead make the target resist this damage, your fire damage, with its frost resistance value since it is lower, which means you overall deal a lot more fire damage on targets with high fire resistance if they have a lower tier of cold or lightning resistance. However, there's one big oversight with the wording here, which is, again, ignites. With the way that this line is currently worded, it should apply its effect to all elemental damage, which should include ignite since that's fire damage, which is elemental damage just dealt over time. But this just does not affect ignites at all. You can hit a gold tier fire resistance mob and see the benefit of your fire hit damage bypassing that large resistance number, since that damage is only going to be affected by the lowest resistance of that mob, but the ignites you dish out will be crappy since they still calculate their damage against that gold tier fire resistance, despite the target being in your presence and the wording on the scepter saying it affects all elemental damage. Not just elemental hits, not just elemental attacks, all elemental damage. So obviously this should affect ignites. They should also calculate their damage against the lowest elemental resistance of the target, just like the fire damage hit that inflicts said ignite, because it currently does not work this way. It does not gain the benefit of the Sacred Flame Scepter when it should. And I mean, it also just makes sense thematically, right? The Sacred Flame Scepter should affect ignites, being the, ultimate flame scepter of the game, or at least that's how I interpret it thematically. All fire things should probably gain some kind of benefit from this, but I digress. Next issue. Here's another such potential issue I've noticed with the Smith of Katava Ascendancy node. I'm currently using Forged in Flame, which reads, modifiers to maximum fire resistance also grant maximum cold and lightning resistance. Seemingly pretty straightforward wording here. However, again, the wording is something that isn't specific enough, or maybe this is just an oversight or a bug, because this doesn't interact with this notable here, crystalline resistance, in the way that I'd expect. Crystalline resistance states plus 1% to all elemental resistances if you have at least 5 red, green, and blue support gems socketed. So one would expect that, seeing as this cranks up all of your maximum elemental resistances, you should see your fire, lightning, and cold maximum resistances increase by 1 each, and then, since we have Forged in Flame, we should see the lightning and cold maximum resistances increase by another 1%, since we are technically modifying maximum fire resistance. But does it work that way? If it does work that way with my current resistances, we should see fire go up to 89% and then cold and lightning resistance go up by 2. So they should both be at the 90% cap when I take this passive skill tree node. So let's see if it works that way. All right, will it work? Will it work? 89 across the board. Nope. As you can see, all the maximum resistances here only increase by 1, and I guess you could argue that the Ascendancy says maximum fire resistance specifically, and the Notable node says all maximum resistances, which could be a little different, but I mean, that's so ambiguous because isn't all maximum resistances, again, technically modifying maximum fire resistance? So therefore, shouldn't it apply the extra 1% to your maximum cold and lightning resistance? I mean, hey, maybe it's just a bug or oversight, but if this is intentional, I mean, this kind of wording needs to be cleared up somehow. Another kind of vague one that I saw being discussed on the subreddit recently is with this class of support gem, and we'll use Etsiri's Impatience for this example, but this honestly applies to any other support gem that supports or interacts with cooldown recovery, but not persistent skills. So this support gem explicitly states in this tooltip that it does not support persistent skills, but it's not very clear that it can support skills that have the persistent tag, as long as they have an active portion to them. Let's use Convalescence as an example. You can see here Convalescence has the persistent tag, and based on the tooltip of Etsiri's Impatience, one might assume that the support gem would not work on Convalescence since it explicitly has the persistence tag, and yet, if you try socketing it, you can socket it and it works. I think changing the wording here to more obviously show that these can work together needs to be easier to understand by the player, I think. Like, yes, Convalescence does technically say it grants a skill in the tooltip, but it's a little weird since it's not like, a weapon that grants you a literal brand new named skill on your skills panel that can be socketed with support gems, etc. It's just kind of looped in with the persistent skill itself, and I do think this warrants making, the support interaction more clear to the player, maybe revising Etsiri's Impatience tooltip to saying cannot support meta skills or persistent skills without active effects or something like that. All right, last thing I want to rant about, this is kind of a wording issue, but I guess it's more of a display issue, but it still fits with the theme of what we've been going over because it will obviously misguide new players with the information being shown, and I'm talking about the percentage damage reduction number for your armor here. So this is just wildly inaccurate. Don't get me wrong, I know there are a lot of numbers and formulas and calculations to attempt to give the player useful information in this game, but I gotta say, this is one of the most offensive inaccuracies in the game as an armor stacking melee player, I guess. Basically, I think this percentage number is more accurate when going through the campaign, but I mean, you need to refer to this like damage mitigation table that someone who doesn't work at GGG put together to get an accurate gauge of what your damage reduction is actually like against some of the bigger physical hits in the game. This 90% is only relevant for hits that hit you for like around 600, I think, and that's the only percent reduction that it wants to show us. I think maybe this is something that GGG will get around to at some point because I'm not even exactly sure how I would go about this number, but Not this. Similar to other stuff, it just feels kind of misguiding in a way. I've seen a few posts where newer players are like, whoa, 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 you know, why am I getting one shot? I have 90% physical damage reduction, and they just aren't aware that this number doesn't mean shit. Anyway, shorter video this time around, guys. I know 0.5.5 is around the corner at this point, which will focus on a ton of balance changes and perhaps introduce some new uniques and potentially new skills to the game, but I really hope they get around to smoothing some of this stuff out before the game releases in 1.0, because, I mean, the more stuff that doesn't function as it should, the less faith newer players will have in the game as they run into these issues. But again, there is overall so much good in this game, so maybe this is all just stuff that stands out to me specifically. I don't know, what can I say? I just want the game to be as polished as it can be before release, and I just hope that they are aware of some of these inaccuracies and ambiguities. So please, I encourage you also to list your own experiences below, like anything that comes off as dysfunctional or unclear in their wording. But that's all I got for this one, guys. I'll see you in the next one.